The 1980s and 1990s brought us some of the most iconic and memorable films in cinema history. Although some went on to have sequels that weren't as highly praised as the originals, they mostly remain as concrete and worthy sequels in those 2 decades of pure Hollywood magic. As a continuation from my previous videos, which were of course the best movie tie-in games that don't suck, as well as the best arcade movie tie-in games, this video is looking at the not so wonderful games which were based on the biggest films of those 2 decades. This video then, on the contrary, is highlighting some of the absolute worst movie game tie-ins, games that simply shouldn't have been put for sale at the time, as well as some which were completely pointless or even so bad that they would make you rage in pure frustration. So today, and as part 3 of this series, we are checking out 10 of the very worst movie to game tie-ins ever made, in which we'll look at several different genres of film, as well as using a range of different computer and console platforms to showcase some of these disaster pieces. But before we start, please don't expect to see E.T. That game has frankly been done to death, and there is actually much worse out there. That is to say, more utterly repulsive cash grabs that you might not necessarily be aware of. If you were a Commodore format reader when Dick Tracy released for the Commodore 64, you could well remember that issue 6 explains that it was the lowest rated game they have ever reviewed at that point. Dick Tracy was released on several platforms for its 1990 cinema release and had a couple of different gameplay styles, but specifically, out of how bad most of them were regardless of platform, the C64 version in particular is what we are looking at here, and the reason being is that it truly is an awful and unfinished mess that should have never been released. I really don't know where to start with it. Now, ZX Spectrum fans will know that color clash is a thing as for hardware limitations. It's not really something that is seen much on the C64 because, very simply put, the Commodore 64 isn't a ZX Spectrum. As we walk slowly through the ugly looking levels, you'll notice that Dick Tracy can sometimes appear to be blending into the background. His yellow coat is the exact same color as the yellow walls, and as we walk through these, you'll notice that all we can see of Dick is everything else that isn't this color, and a good portion of the sprite is actually yellow. You'll also notice that as we walk along, he actually has a line through the middle of his body in which the background shows through it. It kind of reminds me of Melbourne House's Double Dragon for the C64. You'll notice with this pathetic game that hit collision detection doesn't always work, and so when hitting baddies, you are actually hitting thin air as it doesn't always register. The sprites are truly ugly here on every level imaginable. The music at times makes you feel like you're living in a padded cell. It truly is awful. Like I said, the game quite simply put should never have been released to begin with in the state that it's in. It's a broken mess which even struggles to keep the game's music properly running at times. It kind of feels like even the music itself has had enough of it all. It's very possible that this is literally the worst ever Commodore 64 game film tie-in ever made, period. I would even say that Red Heat was better than this game, and that was absolutely atrocious. RoboCop has had a history of a few fairly decent games, such as the arcades game of the original film, and a few home computer versions, such as RoboCop 3 for the Amiga. But there certainly was a load of rubbish in between, and RoboCop 2 certainly was a film that you either loved or hated it, as it had nothing over the original film. But any RoboCop fan will tell you that regardless of loving or hating it, it was most certainly better than the abomination of what we ended up with RoboCop RoboCop 3. So this is the NES version of RoboCop 2. It was also released on a few other platforms. The 8-bit versions of RoboCop 2 was different to what the 16-bit versions received. The 8-bit versions truly were terrible. The name Ocean will crop up a fair amount in this video, and that's who released this game in 1990. Firstly then, just like the Commodore 64 version of this game, the NES game almost feels like RoboCop is walking on ice. He slides around rather than coming to a complete halt when you let go of the joystick. We need to destroy nuke in this game, which are scattered around the level. That sounds simple enough, to just walk into objects marked with an N, and it could have been. Only once we scroll forward, we cannot go back to collect the nuke, and so collecting the quota of nuke to pass the first level can be near damn impossible because of this. We can see it, but we cannot get it because of this problem. We even randomly have nuke which appears on a tiny platform below a bridge, which seems either impossible to get full stop, or was just placed there by mistake. Regardless, the game is just awful because of this, and having RoboCop who slides around adds to the annoyance of playing this game. If we fail collecting a quota of nuke, then we go to a shooting range, which is randomly outside somewhere. And any RoboCop fan will know that when RoboCop needs to practice or recalibrate things, he goes to the police station to do this, and not outside. Although he did do this in the original RoboCop film, but this was in a worn out industrial site of where he was originally murdered as Alex Murphy. The game is just terrible. The 16-bit versions aren't too bad, but were also heavily criticised for their high difficulty levels.
Welcome to Fright Night.
Fright Night, one of my favourite horror films of the 1980s. The music is incredible, the storyline and characters are some of the best, and the humour is nicely executed too throughout the film. I know this film inside out, and I even own the LP of the soundtrack, as well as having a Fright Night picture on my wall. Yes, I dearly love it. And one of the best modern vampire interpretations around, which escapes that dated original vampire formula. The film involves Charlie Brewster, who finds odd things happening with his new next door neighbours. We then meet Peter Vincent, the great vampire killer, played by the legendary Roddy McDowall, who is a TV character and whose show is called Fright Night. To cut a long story short, they pair up and take down Jerry Dandridge, who is the vampire living next door. So we then have a game, and this is exclusive to Amiga. It was literally released for nothing else and has largely been forgotten about through time. Some films really needed no game, and this is seriously one of them. We play as Jerry Dandridge and walk around his house. We randomly find Charlie and Peter, who we need to walk into to suck their blood whilst they're trying to attack us, throwing crucifixes at us. We have generic and stereotypical horror music, which sounds nothing like the music from the film. We have a layout for Jerry's house which looks nothing like the layout from the film. After killing the people in our house, we then move on to the next day where it says, "You survived." We then start all over again, and it gradually gets more difficult as the game goes on. We have generic or horror style things in this game, such as hands coming out the floor, which again never happens in the film. This utterly pointless game released in 1988 by Microdale. I am sure I don't need to explain what Home Alone 2 Lost in New York is about, and I'm also aware it's nowhere near Christmas yet, but this NES 1992 game by THQ seriously needs calling out at this point. This is a terrible game, and after playing it again after many years of trying to avoid it for that very reason, this game is still an awful game. It wasn't just the NES that this game was developed for. Game Boy and even the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive had versions of it, which are all frankly just as terrible. As a kid, I was very likely in the know at the time that the sound effects in this game are ripped straight from Bart vs. the Space Mutants, the NES version that is. You can hear it when Kevin jumps, as he collects things, and most certainly when he is hit. This game was actually developed by the same development team known as Imagineering, who developed both games. They could have at least done something different to make Home Alone 2 for the NES sound different. The Simpsons game has a distinct sound, and it is very clear it is the same with Home Alone 2. It's almost off-putting. Now, besides the music and sound effects being fairly annoying, the storyline is bizarre too. In this storyline, Marv and Harry call the hotel where Kevin is staying and plan to trap or capture him. And of course, this is very different to how the film actually goes. Throughout the game, we are jumping over grannies, suitcases which seem to be possessed as they independently move around to harm you. We have the ability to go inside of doors or shops to snoop around for gadgets to use against the grannies or whatever bizarre enemy arises. And to be fair, most of these weapons are kind of useless, especially the necklace, which has a terrible throwing range. We can scroll for our inventory with the select button, again pretty much like Bart vs the Space Mutants. It's a horrible game that sounds and looks terrible, a typical example of one of those massive blockbuster films where a cash grab game was made with little care of the final product. Next up is the excruciatingly terrible Red Heat, which, surprise surprise, is another ocean game. I actually did a whole video on every version of this game some time back too, and that was painful as each version was pretty much the same, only with better visuals on some particular platforms. The game itself is the same on every platform, and on every platform is utterly shocking. A quick rundown of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film itself, for those not in the know, it's essentially one of those 80s buddy cop films where an unlikely couple of cops get together. In this case, Arnie plays Ivan Danko, a Soviet cop who travels to America to find his colleague's killer, who happens to be a kingpin, whilst James Belushi plays a character known as Ridzik, who coincidentally gets assigned to the same case as Arnie's character. It's a typical film of the era, and not particularly one of Arnie's best of the decade either. So as you see in the gameplay, this is of course the ZX Spectrum version of the game, and it truly is as boring as it looks. We get a cinematic presentation where Arnie's lower half, as well as enemies' lower body parts, are hidden away. Each level in the game is the same. We move forward, or attempt to move forward, as we are battered by enemies constantly pinning us in the corner of the screen as many come to attack you. In most cases, and in this version, hit collision detection is truly awful, and the controls are very clunky too. We can pick up objects as we slowly scroll through the levels, which sometimes don't even register that you're pressing forward to collect these random things. We at times get a burst of bullets heading our way which we cannot duck or even avoid getting hit by. The game all released roughly around the same time, and like I say, they are all truly bad games. When I said surprise surprise, it's another ocean game with Red Heat, this is exactly what I meant. Ocean Software was by far no stranger to putting out terrible film to game tie-ins, and Dennis is likely one of the better known terrible games in this list. This absurd game released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo, Game Boy and the Amiga, which had an AGA version. The film itself was okay, nothing particularly special, and it's largely been forgotten about over the years, with not even a mention of any remake or anything else. A typical troublesome but lovable kid who causes typical boy-like trouble for his neighbour, Mr. Wilson. You know the story. Oddly enough, here in the UK, Dennis can be a little confusing as we have a comic book known as Dennis the Menace in Nasher, and it's a completely different thing to the American Dennis the Menace. Anyways, as for this game, it's just god-awful. A game I played as a kid on my SNES, which I likely tried to enjoy at the time, but in reality, it truly is shockingly bad. We have platforms in the game where it appears that we can jump on them, but we just jump through them, such as tables. We have not so obvious things we need to jump on to reach higher objects, such as coins. We also have a few weapons, such as a water pistol and slingshot, and most of the time, these don't actually do anything. anything. You would assume that squirting water at a cat might make it run away or even kill it. Not with this game. They just carry on like nothing has even happened. It seems that some enemies like bats can be killed with weapons, but others cannot be. It's just either confusing or just clearly broken. Talking about broken, the music is what I would say as annoying as a broken record. I mean, really, this game had the qualities of being something half decent. The visuals are decent enough, but as a game, it makes no sense, and Dennis sounds like an old dude when he is hit. If you wasted hours playing this growing up, then you truly weren't alone. Many of us suffered with this game. If you have never seen this pitiful excuse of a game before, well, this is Ocean Software's Highlander, and this is the Commodore 64 release specifically. Ocean also released it for the Amstrad CPC as well as the ZX Spectrum, all of which were slammed fairly badly at the time, and here I am personally slamming it all of this time later in 2025. So what is Highlander? It's considered a cult classic these days, although on its theatrical release back in 1986, it was considered as a bit of a failure at the time. It made just under $13 million in the box office and was made at $19 million. Let me give this some context. The original and awesome Crocodile Dundee also released in 1986 and was made at a mere $8.8 million and had a box office success of $328 million. Top Gun also released the same year, and you can imagine the success of that film too. So yeah, Highlander was off to a bad start from the get-go, even with the film, let alone this miserable Ocean game to go with it. Now, seriously, what you see is what you get here, a complete and utter pathetic mess of a game that happens to have the legendary Martin Galway's name on it, as he produced the music for the game. And this really is the best thing about Highlander. Just load it up and listen to Galway, but don't actually play it. Of course, extremely oversized sprites which look shockingly bad, a control system as we fight against the opponent that doesn't really make much sense. If you happen to beat the opponent, then it is simply down to pure luck, just like what happened to me whilst recording this video. The sound effects whilst we are sword fighting sounds much like ping pong, where the ball bounces off walls making a sound. Let's just say it sounds like something reminiscent of a late 1970s game. This game is a disaster on every level. Everybody loves Back to the Future. The trilogy is awesome and an absolute joy to watch for most people. They are quality films and very cleverly written films. Sure, Back to the Future 3 wasn't as great as the first two films, but it's definitely not a film that is known to be terrible. The Back to the Future games are terrible, well, up until 2010, where Back to the Future had a new game and was actually playable. In general, the original run of the games from the 1980s and early 90s are known to be all bad. This is specifically Back to the Future Part 3 on Sega Mega Drive. I haven't touched this game in years, and playing it again makes me realise why that is. This is the most infuriating game on the Sega Mega Drive, and likely you will watch this and feel the pain. That frustration and pure anger that galloping along the first level of the game brings is totally real here. We need to catch up with Clara and rescue her on the horse just like in the film. The issue is that this is near impossible to achieve. I didn't beat it in the early 90s and I cannot beat it here in 2025 either. It's just impossible and there is no need for its sheer difficulty level. Arena released this godforsaken abomination in 1991 and I would imagine that many kids who played this at the time raged in anger like myself. The objects that we need to duck from and jump over while shooting backwards to fend off Mad Dog and his gang are just far too much here. It's like the objects that we need to dodge are at times so close together that we end up falling off the horse that Doc is riding on. Really, if you can make it past the first bridge without the aid of a Game Genie cheat, my hat's off to you. Something even more annoying is of course the darkened colour. This game, or at least in some parts of the world, was actually released like this at the time. I had the PAL version back in the day and remember it looking like this at the time. Legend has it that Back to the Future Part 3 has a few different style levels after beating the first level, which almost makes it seem like a minigame compilation. If one day you feel like getting angry but cannot find anything to make you feel angry, then play Back to the Future Part 3 on Mega Drive and you will get what you need in less than 60 seconds. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was a film I'd love to watch growing up. 2 films in one whilst documenting Michael Jackson's early day in the spotlight with, say, the Jackson 5. It was pretty much a film dedicated for fans with an awesome soundtrack, and videos included one of my personal favourites from Bad, which was Speed Demon. Some fairly good animation for the time too, where Michael dresses up as a bunny to avoid the paparazzi and utterly obsessed fans. It was a great film during an era where big stars at the time felt it was necessary to go into film. David Bowie had an awesome film such as Labyrinth and a couple of others that he actually did, and Paul McCartney had Give My Regards to Broad Street and so on. We had an awesome arcades game for Moonwalker, which most people loved and still do love, and we had a Mega Drive version of Moonwalker, which wasn't that bad, although a little repetitive as most would argue. We then had the US Golden releases for 8-bit and 16-bit computers. This of course is the Amstrad CPC release. This is likely one of the most boring games you'll ever play. It kind of reminds me of Pac-Man, especially the first stage, as you will see in the gameplay. The aim of level 1 then is to easily get annoyed with the constant 8-bit chiptune interpretation of Bad, whilst walking around pathways looking for objects to pass the level. As we collect objects, Michael's image on the right hand side of the screen begins changing. We also have paparazzi and fans to avoid. Like I said, kinda like the same thing as Pac-Man, or at least the principle of it. Collect things around a maze whilst avoiding baddies. We have a map highlighting where objects are located, but most of the time, by attempting to follow the map, leads you to dead ends. It's a relentlessly boring game to play, and it just drags and drags and drags. I have never made it past the first level out of sheer boredom. The music itself just doesn't help with the boredom. Rather than encourage you to play more, it just makes you feel like turning the game off, which is exactly what I did. We are going to end this video off today with a film game tie-in that is pretty damn atrocious, and that is Batman Forever, which released for several platforms, including that very bizarre Arzone short-lived console which Argos once sold. If you remember the hype around the release of Batman Forever back in 1995, you'll also remember all of the merch which came with it. I even had a Batman Forever themed cassette tapes at the time, and what made this film likely even more popular was the fact that Jim Carrey starred in it as the Riddler, and of course at the time of this film releasing, Jim Carrey was huge amongst teenagers in particular. As a film itself, for me, it was a little bit of a disappointment, as we suddenly went from Tim Burton's reimagining of Gotham City and back to the hyper neon comic book style film, more like the original 1960s Batman TV series. There was of course an arcade game and a couple of 32-bit ports which were fairly criticised at the time and very different to what the console's got, but we are looking at the SNES version, and it's interesting adopting that Mortal Kombat fighting engine and the digitized sprites to give the game that more realistic look, which at the point of development was already clear that 16-bit consoles could not do this too well, with the exception of Donkey Kong Country of course. The game itself is fairly bad. What makes it very frustrating is that there are times where we do not have any clear indication of where to go, as most of the time things are so dark and it's hard to see things too. Gadgets that we can select from the options screen before the game starts just don't work very well, as you'll see from the gameplay footage, as the controls are also a complete mess. I played this game as a young teenager and ended up just giving up with it, and here we are in 2025 and around 3 minutes into the game and I've already done the same again. Now, by no means is this video every worst game ever made. There will be another part of this coming soon. So which game based on the film was your absolute nightmare? Let us know in the comments, and if you've not watched the best film to game tie-ins, then be sure to check those out. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching. You know, I honestly had no idea that bad film game tie-ins were so popular on YouTube, but after releasing the first part just over 2 weeks back, the amount of views that video had to date still shocks me. Why would you search for terrible games based on very often successful Hollywood films? I suppose, just like myself, you love gaming history, and just out of intrigue, you just had to see some of these terrible games that you might have heard about back in the day, or even owned and had the displeasure of paying money for a game that ended up gathering dust for years on end. So with the popularity and the audience wanting more of these videos, clearly, I present to you the worst movie game tie-ins ever made part 2. Trust me, this video contains much worse content than the original video, and I've also catered for many different platforms again, ranging from the 3DO, Sega Mega CD, as well as much more the mainstream systems such as Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as the C64. I have included a range of film genres in this compilation, which some publishers believed it would be a great thing to base a game on, even though most of the time it simply wasn't. If you didn't get around to watching the first part of this video, I'll leave a link to it in the comments section, so you'll have another 10 awful film game tie-ins to watch after this one. Anyways, that's enough introduction talking. We have another 10 of the worst film game tie-ins ever made to get through. This game is far from excellent, as Wayne Campbell would say in Wayne's World. Honestly, Wayne's World as a game is just, well, utterly ridiculous. Now, at which point in the first Wayne's World film would make you think that this was suitable material for being put onto a game cartridge? The closest you would get was the Noah's Arcade commercial scene in the film, but even still, that alone surely wasn't a basis for turning Wayne's World into a game of its own. You get pointless and unnecessary film game tie-ins, and then you get this, which is on an entirely different level altogether. So there were a couple of different versions of Wayne's World. The developers Grey Matter worked on the Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive versions, and Radical Entertainment worked on the Nintendo Game Boy and NES versions. There was even a DOS version of it, which was a little more like one of those classic point-and-click Lucasfilm style games. All these were rated fairly bad, and for good reason too. Wayne's World just wasn't needed or really wanted as a video game. I grew up watching both films, and they go down as two of my favourites of the 90s. The music, the alternative style, and the comedy value and characters were all equally great, which made them two solid films. Although, admittedly, my personal favourite to date is actually the sequel. So the SNES version which I'm playing here, I actually owned this likely for a day or two, and then traded it in for something else originally. Yes, it really was that bad, but the idea of having a SNES game at the time based on one of my favourite films won me over, clearly. The first thing to irritate you with this game is the voice samples of Wayne Campbell. These are made very obvious when they are frequently heard throughout the game, because they totally drown out the already irritating background music. Swing. Phrases and words such as not, swing, excellent, and we're not worthy will slowly begin to wear at you. Not worthy, not worthy, not... The idea of Wayne's World is to collect things and shoot sound waves at enemy musical instruments using your guitar. In no way whatsoever is it even connected to the film. I mean, at what point in either film was Garth kidnapped and Wayne had to rescue him? The levels are entirely messy, and Wayne's head reminds me of one of those Funko Pop figures. Really, this game is an absolute waste of time with just 4 unnecessarily long stages, and it even goes above what Wayne and Garth hated within the original film, that idea of corporate greed. very likely one of the most pointless games based on a film ever made, and certainly one that does very little to tell the player that they are in fact playing a Back to the Future game. You might expect the classic Back to the Future theme in an 8-bit style, but nope, we have a looping and very annoying track here, which sounds like nothing at all from any of the films, although it's supposed to be the Power of Love as well as an 8-bit version of Johnny Be Good, which again sounds nothing like these songs at all. Even the sound effects here are really terrible. Before levels begin, we get a map of Hill Valley, which actually reminds me of Paperboy, how this is laid out more than anything else. We then start the game and our goal is to reach the top of stages and avoid being hit. We have a lot of random things here which is out to cause us harm, such as bumblebees, random ladies dancing on the streets, random men that walks towards us. We need to walk into clocks, which gives us more time to reach the end of the levels. Like I said, there really isn't anything remotely similar here to the film. I mean, we have the start screen which says Back to the Future and also have the map of Hill Valley, and that's pretty much about it. LJN put this nonsense out back in 1989, so 4 years after the original release of the film itself, this is when this nonsense appeared. If Marty walks in front of certain things such as benches, you'll lose a life. I covered Back to the Future 3 for the Sega Mega Drive in the first part of this video, and I'm not sure which one of these is actually the worst. Robin Hood Prince of Thieves holds a seriously awesome memory for me personally. My dad rented it out when it released on VHS around 1992, although the cinema release for this film was in 1991. But as you know, films took much longer in those days to become available on home video. Easily recognised for Robin Hood being played by Kevin Costner for having that American accent with no attempt to sound British at all. Easily recognisable for the brilliant casting with Morgan Freeman and Alan Rickman, who played the Sheriff of Nottingham. This film was just awesome due to its casting and storyline. It was also a huge box office success in earning itself just over 390 million. We received both a Game Boy version and a Nintendo Entertainment System version back in 1992, one by Virgin Games and the other one by Mindscape. As for the game itself, both versions are fairly pretty much the same and both are fairly poor too. It's of course an overhead RPG based game, which to its credit follows the film carefully. We start the game inside of a prison in Jerusalem and it pretty much follows the film's storyline here. We rescue Peter and Azim and then use our menu options to search areas for keys to unlock doors. We then have some one-on-one duels and also much more zoomed out overhead perspective stages. The different perspectives of the game is what really ruins it more than anything else. There are particular areas where it looks like we're able to walk, but it actually prevents you from doing so. The depth and height of objects then are a little all over the place here, and the animations for characters truly look nothing like what they're supposed to look like from the film. Take a look at Morgan Freeman's Azim character, for instance. RPG games can be fairly long, and at best we should have a simple password system here. Allegedly, this game was originally supposed to have one, but in the final product it was actually removed, which is ridiculous as this game can get fairly challenging, and only with having 3 lives and a couple continues, it's fairly painful at times. It's not the absolute worst game in this list by any means, but not at all is it a good game either. We don't talk much about the 3DO console on this channel much, and truth be told, I have a major soft spot for the quirkiness of many of the 3DO games. Most very experimental and also very bizarre too. Jurassic Park Interactive, however, is something completely different and quite frankly, a boring experience based on the fairly exciting and groundbreaking film which released back in '93. If you remember the wow factor at the time, you know exactly what I mean by groundbreaking. Then we have this 3DO release, which is far from anything groundbreaking. Considering that this game cost between an estimated $1 to $2 million at the time to be produced, consisting of 10 different coders, and with Universal Interactive releasing it, you might then assume that this game could be one of the best on the 3DO. But instead, it is one of the very worst. What we have here is essentially a few mini-games that range from shooting down dinosaurs which randomly disappear in some kind of Star Trek fashion. We have a seriously terrible game which is some kind of blatant Space Invaders ripoff, where we must shoot up at squares and hit the dinosaurs which flip to characters from the film, which we need to avoid hitting. The music whilst this minigame is playing is just absolutely ridiculous, and what makes it even more ridiculous is how the music suddenly starts playing and then randomly stops. It's kind of like Space Invaders meets musical chairs. The squares shoot down at us and it's so quick that it's difficult not to get hit. The game, and I loosely say game, is just a load of nonsense used in a fancy interactive looking system to excuse its very poor minigames, which by 1994 looked really bad. So how the hell did a game costing between $1 to $2 million, 10 different coders, and also being released by Universal Interactive end up with something as bad as this? This is Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Sega Mega CD. This game released on several platforms at the time and also had a few different versions of the game itself. I hate to say this, but legendary developer Psygnosis actually programmed this version for the Sega Mega CD. To give you a bit of context, Psygnosis were responsible for many classics, most notably for the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST. Games such as Shadow of the Beast Trilogy, Lemmings, Misadventures of Flink, and even Second Samurai. They also developed Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Amiga too, but it is this one which is likely the worst of the bunch, which is different from the Amiga version anyways. I'll be honest, there came a point in the game where I was thinking of the film Arachnophobia, and then the Disney film Fantasia popped into mind too. When playing a horror themed game, the thought of Disney films isn't what you should be thinking about, but when flying books whirl across the screen, it just seems like something very childlike. And not at all horrific in any sense of the word. Now, I also mentioned arachnophobia too, and for good reason. There are spiders everywhere out to harm you once we get inside of the castle. Most irritating with this release is its controls. As you will notice, Psygnosis were trying to get some kind of Mortal Kombat fighting system inside of this game, and it's fairly bad. What's even more awful with the controls is when we have many creepy crawlers heading our way, it is impossible to hit them whilst they are crawling on the ground, and jumping over them doesn't always work, as there is normally a few of them at any one time. Obviously, the game features digitized backgrounds, which to be fair actually doesn't look that bad, and of course the video you are watching is just emulation with a shader applied for the CRT effect. The real issue here though is its gameplay. It just doesn't seem to appear to know what it's going for. We essentially have a crossbreed of Mortal Kombat and Fantasia. The game is also fairly buggy too. For example, there was a time when I was playing this where I went to exit a stage and it literally wouldn't let me exit the stage until a spider walked off screen entirely. The music used in this game is extremely generic and very dated even for this release of 1992. We also have many FMV scenes which really haven't aged too well, and fairly bad voice acting to go with it too. The sprite itself for Keanu Reeves, who plays Jonathan in the film, doesn't really look like Keanu Reeves. We do have some horror style sprites from time to time, which is good to see rather than bats and rats. But still, the game is a mess due to bad controls and the lack of attack moves. It gets so bad as the screen just bombards itself with far too much at once, in which most times we are just being hit without having the ability to defend ourselves. The game was largely a victim of the FMV era, where more effort was put into how the game looked rather than focusing on the gameplay.
The year of our Lord, 1897. Jonathan Harker takes his first brave steps on his long...
Love it or hate it, the original Crow had a sequel a couple years later in 1996. I was totally hyped for this film at the time and remember it being reviewed on Channel 4 by a particular film critic. I am in my minority, but I actually enjoyed this film more than most did. Sure, it wasn't Brandon Lee, but let's remember the actor who played Ash in this film wasn't trying to be Brandon Lee. This was a new character entirely with his own story of vengeance. Regardless, people didn't like it in general. Little did they know that we had a couple more releases to come after this, which were pretty much straight to home video. And let's not forget that truly horrendous abomination last year. I'll just mention Tattoos and you'll know the film I mean. So a year after City of Angels release, we had a game of the film for PlayStation, Sega Saturn and even DOS. Why? Really, at this point, developers and publishers acclaiming this instance all pretty much knew that the film wasn't much appreciated, let alone putting out a terrible game. This just didn't really help matters. So what is wrong with the Crow City of Angels? Well, I could go through many things, but it could likely take a whole video alone to do this. We'll get to the nitty gritty then. This game truly sucks in every possible way. So firstly, controlling Ash is very bizarre. As you can see, it's designed in the Resident Evil style, but at least Resident Evil was manageable to move around. This is just hopeless. I attempt to grab a weapon at the start of the game, but I cannot pick it up regardless of how many buttons and combinations I press. Hitting enemies is one of the worst things here. Of course, hit collision detection is shockingly bad. The camera angles in this game make it incredibly hard and disorientating as to see things and where to actually go. It's just a complete disaster of a game, and it's a shame. It could have been an interesting beat 'em up. It was just clearly either left in the wrong hands or somebody just gave up with it and then released it regardless of how broken it was. Possibly one of modern cinema's most known commercial failures. This is Cutthroat Island, a film that released in 1995 and was a fairly doomed project from the get-go. It had several shooting delays, which meant that money was spent out unnecessarily on its production. Many crew members behind the camera ended up quitting due to major disputes. Pipes containing raw sewage burst into water tanks where the actors were supposed to swim. Script changes was also commonplace. Behind the scenes was so bad that even the original cinematographer broke his leg during the shooting and had to be replaced. When people talk about notorious films from the 1990s with notorious behind the scene happenings, they often talk about Waterworld. I am sure this seemed much worse so in many ways. Honestly, I have never watched Cutthroat Island when it released or even rented it at the time when it released. I was never particularly a fan of swashbuckler films. I was never even sold on Pirates of the Caribbean either. The only swashbuckling themed film I would even rate as quality is The Goonies, but that's another story. So we have Gina Davis starring in Cutthroat Island, but I personally know her much better as starring with Samuel L. Jackson a year later in The Long Kiss Goodnight, and damn, that film was and still is an awesome film. Cutthroat Island was such a disaster that it cost around $115 million to produce and only earned back $16 million at the box office. The same year of 1995 also saw the release of The Awesome Dangerous Minds, which was a massive success, earning itself just under $180 million at the box office, with a production cost of just $23 million. That same year also seen the release of Casper, which were also massively successful financially. So yes, Cutthroat Island was a disaster in every possible way. As for the games, in which Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, Game Gear and the Game Boy each had a game of the film, these were all slaughtered too as being fairly bad games. I chose the Sega Mega Drive version of Cutthroat Island to showcase here. It's a fairly boring game which Acclaim released in 1995, so any old school gamer will agree the whole beat 'em up genre was done to death by 1995, and there was a hell of a lot better even going back to the 80s in comparison to this game, which was much superior to this. But it's not just a scroll and beat 'em up as such, as it also and pointlessly has a one-on-one fight fighting system too, almost like it's attempting to do a Street Fighter style, which fails miserably at it too. The graphics for a 16-bit system are laughable, and also considering that it's a 1995 release, so other developers create much more impressive looking games such as Comic Zone, as well as the awesome Vector Man, then this game looked more like an 8-bit console game and looked very dated at this point. The controls feel very wooden too. The music used on the Mega Drive's version is also terrible and sounds more like something that the NES could produce. When I say terrible, I truly mean it. The music is absolutely diabolical. It's also got other styles of gameplay, such as those irritating fast moving levels where we need to avoid things without being hit, a little like Back to the Future 3. Legend has it that if you can be bothered to play this game any further, the labyrinth levels will cause you to lose your shit altogether due to its insane difficulty and lack of password system, which makes it even more infuriating to play. Last Action Hero was definitely a Marmite type film. You either loved it or hated it because of its bizarreness and very quirky storyline. A fairly unique film then, and especially out of the ordinary for Arnold Schwarzenegger, who at which point at the release of Last Action Hero in '93 was still riding high with the monumental success of T2. The game of Last Action Hero on its many platforms that it released on were all rated generally bad in their day. There were a couple of different versions such as the shoddy Amiga's beat 'em up style game, but we are of course looking at the original Game Boy's version here. This is the version I had back in the day, as of which point I knew this was a terrible game, even as a kid. So much so that I actually took it back to W.H. Smith's and claimed it didn't work, and so swapped it over with a Kirby game instead. That era was clearly a doddle to do something like this, and it worked too. Although when my mum found out about this, she took Kirby away from me, never to be seen again. Anyways, the Game Boy version itself, what can I say? It's a very depressing game with equally depressing music. Considering the soundtrack to the film had classics from Megadeth, AC/DC, Alice in Chains and even Anthrax, this music, although an 8-bit portable, was just shockingly terrible. Admittedly, and to date, I've never made it past the first stage here, which is clearly based on the opening of the film itself, where we need to defeat the Ripper on top of the roof and rescue Jack Slater's son. The problem with this game is its immense difficulty level. Hitting enemies that stand in our way at times are tough to hit. Not only do they take many hits to finally defeat, but they randomly shoot too, which at short notice is very hard to avoid bullets. We also need to have Jack Slater positioned extremely carefully before punching enemies, otherwise you'll just bounce off the enemy and take a hit. The aim of this game is to collect all cinema tickets whilst also being timed, which is pretty unforgiving, especially when making it to a few floors up on the first level to then get hit off by something or fall into a lower floor. This game gets far too frustrating far too quickly, and if you miss just one cinema ticket, you cannot progress. To date, I cannot find the last damn cinema ticket to exit the first stage. Arnold Schwarzenegger as Jack Slater also appears to be a fireman too in this game, as he hoses down burning doors. Sony ImageSoft released this game in October of 1993, and considering its release month, it is very likely that this trashy game was a birthday present too at the time. For those who suffered with this game back in the day, I truly hope you got rid of it and replaced it for a much better game.
Tully, my good man, how about playing a round of golf?
Whilst most other systems had very great versions of the Addams Family by Ocean, especially the 16-bit versions, the PC Engine had a very different take on it altogether. NEC Icon released this exclusive game for this system in 1991, the same year as the film release. You might assume that considering the Ocean versions were very acceptable and very good too, that this release might have followed suit and aims for the same style, but nope. What we have here truly is something else altogether, which is very strange. Within my arcade port series, it's normally the case that if a PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 had a port of the same game, they were generally superior in every way compared with 8-bit and 16-bit computer versions. But with this, it is the total opposite. Not only is the game fairly ugly to look at, but it's terrible to play too. As you can see, the bottom of the gameplay screen has an audience watching, and so the game is laid out as if we were playing in front of a cinema audience, which is a little bizarre. Normally in the Addams Family games we play as either Gomez, Uncle Fester, or even Pugsley. Here we play as the Bourne attorney who is after stealing the Addams treasures in their vault, which is a strange concept and playing as a baddie for a change. The game starts off where we need to dodge balls which are being whacked at us by Gomez in the background, and we get a bizarre encounter with Uncle Fester once we enter the Addams mansion who is attacking us. We are armed with an umbrella which we can use to fire at creepy crawlers, which kind of reminded me of Bram Stoker's Dracula. These insects just don't give up. Going back to the sprites, these are designed fairly ugly and very basic here. It's very surprising that this was actually an official release at all, and it was also unusual how a European game of this era was vastly superior than something that came out in Japan. It's very strange to think that Cobra on the ZX Spectrum is considered to be one of the computer's best games ever made, yet Commodore 64 version is considered to be one of the very worst games ever made, but also different too. Cobra is a 1986 Sylvester Stallone film which, although was a very big hit at the time, went down as a film that had very mixed opinions. The film itself is known to be one of those films which had a troubled production for many reasons. Stallone was messing around with actress Bridget Nielsen at the time, which caused delays in filming. Supporting actors and extras were strictly prohibited from talking to Stallone, and generally constant changes with the script. You could say that Sylvie was full of ego at this point, and that's not to badmouth him. I love Stallone, one of my favourite actors of the 80s. A bit of random trivia for you, but originally Stallone was going to play Eddie Murphy's lead role in Beverly Hills Cop, but after Sylvie's script changed for it, removing most comedy aspects and including over-budget action scenes, Stallone was then replaced by Eddie Murphy, and the script which Stallone was working on for Beverly Hills Cop then partly formed its own film in which Cobra was born. So going back to the Commodore 64 game, it's very likely then that just like the film itself, Ocean, who released this C64 version in 1986, might have possibly been involved in script changes, although script changes in terms of code. Either that or it was a release that needed to be out at a particular date in 1986 and was half developed, which wasn't out of the ordinary for Ocean Software. The C64 version of RoboCop is a good example of this. You will see that this is an ugly game, isn't really the best looking. Sure, this was a 1986 game, and the Commodore 64 was just a few years old at this point, but there was better looking games around in this. Firstly, moving around kind of feels like there's a strong wind pushing towards Sylvester, and just feels like he should be able to move around faster than what he actually does, and this gets frustrating very quickly, since enemies move around much quicker, and so did our bullets, which brings me to health. Enemies will deplete this extremely quickly. You can grab health, but it won't last more than 40 seconds. Sprites are fairly laughable here too. They sometimes fall through platforms whether they like it or not. Hitting enemies, well, 90% of the time are okay, but other times, enemy sprites don't detect any collision detection at all. The level design is fairly messy here too. It kind of feels like you should be able to walk on particular platforms in the game area, but it just won't let you. I even noticed that at times ladders work and other times when attempting to climb them, it just won't register at all. This game is a classic example of Ocean Software releasing absolute half-baked nonsense. It's not fun in any way particularly. The only good thing about this game is the music by Ben Daglish. And that's it for another 10 of the very worst movie to game tie-ins. So, as always, which game did you suffer with back in the day? For me, as you know, Last Action Hero was absolutely a nightmare. And playing these games, I'd happily say that the Addams Family on the PC Engine CD was probably the worst out of all of these. Anyways, drop a comment in the comment section and let us know if you necessarily agrees with this list today. Anyways, until next time, stay retro. A new episode of the worst movie the game tie-ins today, making this part 3 in this series with many more to come in the future. Many have wondered how I managed to cope with some of the worst games ever put to cartridge, disc or cassette tape. The simple answer is I don't cope. I play most of these games with computing history in mind and upload them as a reference to how awful publishers once were. There was a time where anything which went to the cinema normally ended up getting a game, and it truly didn't matter how terrible or how unfinished it was. You likely, just like many others around the world, truly felt sucked in, that you either just wasted your paper round money or was saving for a little while to get conned into buying a game that was advertised like the best thing since sliced bread. To actually get a game that disappointed you so much that you have never forgotten about how bad it was. For me, personally, Robocop on the C64 was the most disappointing due to its bug. So we have another 10 god-awful games that should have never been even considered to be a game in the first place, or should simply have never been released, full stop. I swear, the more of these games that I play, the worse they are becoming, and there truly is some stinkers in today's part 3 of the worst movie games tie-ins ever. I think having a game based on Beethoven is just testament to those attempting cash grabs on big films, and of course the original Beethoven film in '92 was a fairly successful film. The 80s and 90s in cinema seen its fair share of dogs being used as the main stars of the show, K9, Turner and Hooch, and to some extent these films were generally good cheesy family fun and nothing else. So why on earth would you even consider turning the gigantic St. Bernard into a game? It just doesn't really work at all, and I honestly believe that High-Tech Expressions, who released this game, actually titled as Beethoven the Ultimate K9 Caper, likely knew that this game was terrible, but never mind the people who paid good money for this game at the time, it's Beethoven and that's all that matters, simply. I will also remind you here that although the box art for this game doesn't mention it being a sequel of the original film, we sure realise this when the game boots up. As you can see, it's no longer Ultimate K9 Caper, but rather Beethoven's second. Now, clearly Beethoven's sprite is just way too big for this game. I understand fully that Beethoven was a big dog in the film, but they could have easily shrunk the size of the sprite, easily enough to do. The size is a big problem and controlling it is terrible too. It's not that Buttons doesn't respond at all, it's just ridiculously clunky and it's hard to avoid things due to the size of Beethoven. What makes it even more difficult to control is the fact that Beethoven actually slides. If you notice, when I let go of D-pad, Beethoven slides just like he is on ice of some kind. Now, if we want to kill cats and other domestic animals and even humans, we can bark at them generally around 3 or 4 times and they will just go up in a puff of smoke. There are bones scattered around the levels, which you might assume you could walk into and use them as energy of some kind, but no matter how many times I try to pick these up, nothing actually happens. Come Worlds 2, we can even jump on bouncing things to reach higher platforms. What did the development team honestly think? That this was going to be something like Sonic the Hedgehog? It's truly mind-boggling stuff. As for music, all you will hear is Roll Over Beethoven, which sounds terrible for a Super Nintendo game, or at least this version does. If you really feel the urge to play this game, then mute the sounds and play Electric Light Orchestra's Roll Over Beethoven. At least then you could partially have some fun playing this utter trash. An extremely bizarre exclusive game came to PlayStation 2 in 2006 with Beverly Hills Cop. Let's bear in mind that at this point Beverly Hills Cop was a huge success in cinema over 20 years prior to this Blast Entertainment release, which nobody frankly asked for. What makes it even stranger is that there were Beverly Hills Cop games in 1990, which actually spanned across multiple platforms, including the BBC Micro, the Amiga, and the ZX Spectrum. And to be fair, although those those original games weren't really anything special, they were certainly superior to this utter nonsense. It just makes no sense in any way, shape or form. Interestingly, I mentioned the Beverly Hills Cop in the last video of this series, where Sylvester Stallone was originally to play what became Eddie Murphy's iconic Axel Foley character. Instead, Stallone went on to release Cobra. So, what is wrong with this game? Surely for a late PlayStation 2 release of 2006, and considering the PlayStation 3 was on the eve of releasing, this game should be looking good graphically at least? Well, it fails at pretty much everything it attempts. Like I said, it makes no sense whatsoever, to the point that even the box art for the game doesn't even show Eddie Murphy sitting on the car. You might think that we get the original Beverly Hills Cop theme music with this game. Well, no, what we do get though is a cheap 1980s sounding soundtrack, which is attempting to sound like the theme tune. At this point, one has to wonder even if Blast Entertainment even had the permission to even release this game. As the game loads up, we see imagery which looks like it's trying to copy something like Grand Theft Auto Vice City of some kind, and this concretes it when dying. We start the stage with some random man who looks nothing like Eddie Murphy whatsoever. I would likely say this man looks more like some kind of escaped convict who is desperately on the run for somebody. So we start a game where we need to avoid enemies and climb a ladder which leads us into a garage. The serious annoyance is that whilst outside, if an enemy sees us, we go right back to the start and have to suffer watching the cutscene all over again. And this gets very tiring very quickly. Being caught happens a fair amount here. What makes this even slower is that we can't actually run in this game. We get inside of the garage and we can then begin to shoot, or so I thought. I continuously shot an enemy, and after around 15 shots he actually finally dies, which I wasn't expecting. The most ridiculous thing is that below us inside this garage is hordes of people, and not one of them even attempts to shoot at us regardless of the noise we're making. I then begin shooting downwards at an enemy and nothing happens. Bullet marks appear and that's about all that happens, whilst an enemy appears to get stuck next to a car in some kind of weird bugged loop. I just don't get this game, and it gets even worse. Even if we die whilst inside of the garage, well, guess what? We literally have to go right back to the start of the game and watch the cutscene all over again. In general, the enemy AI in this game is some of the worst I've ever seen. Even if you shoot at somebody and a crowd of enemies are right next to you, they'll likely not move or even flinch or even come to investigate. I'll happily say at this point then, Beverly Hills Cop for a PlayStation 2 is probably one of the worst games on this system, if not the worst. If you was a big fan of Days of Thunder when it released in cinemas back in 1990 and was a gamer at the time, you likely would have been looking forward to taking on the role of Tom Cruise at home whilst waiting for some time for it to be released on VHS, as per usual for waiting for films to release on VHS back in those days. Days of Thunder released on many platforms at the time, mainly computers, although the Nintendo Entertainment System had a version too. Largely they were all different to the Amiga version, although that's not to say they were any better than this one. They were all fairly bad. Mindscape developed the Amiga version and a year later went on to develop the terrible Final Fight port, and a year after that they even did a worse job with Street Fighter 2 port. So yeah, not particularly the best team to be working on something on this scale in terms of 3D on an Amiga 500. If left in the capable hands, then a stock Amiga 500 was fairly capable of doing 3D. Robocop 3, for example, was a masterful production and extremely playable, and to date too. And in the same year as this release, Electronic Arts released Indianapolis 500, which is a superb 3D racing simulation game, and very well regarded too for its technical achievements. Then there is Days of Thunder, a pure slugfest with absolutely terrible sound effects to go with it. We actually have options at the start of the game to lower details in the game so it can run slightly faster, but honestly I really wouldn't bother. It runs as bad as the default high detail option. The game is so bad that it was actually on the Screen Gems pack on disc, which thankfully would have been more useful to wipe and copy something better onto it with Xcopy. It's a pure slugfest of a game that controls very bad too, and of course a racing game is nothing without speed. It's supposed to be fast. I mean, the frame rates here probably aren't much better than hard driving for the Commodore 64, and that's really saying something. No Escape is one of those films which was majorly hyped up at the time but ultimately failed, or at least had very mixed opinions at the time from film critics for its quality and substance when it released in cinemas back in 1994. Ray Liotta starred in this film, which at this point was very well known for his amazing performance as Henry in Goodfellas, and that was perhaps one of the greatest Scorsese's films ever made. I think Ray Liotta was typecast as a gangster actor at this point, and having him star as an action star didn't really make much sense. Of course, times were changing, and the face of the 1980s action style, being muscle madness and bodybuilding looks, was beginning to look dated in all fairness. I think likely Bruce Willis made this look old-fashioned in Die Hard. The film then is pretty much a sci-fi action film set in the near future where prisoners are seen as assets. Ray Liotta is the star of the film and shoots down bad guys. You know the score. We have the Mega Drive game here, and it starts off incredibly bad. From the get-go, we are bombarded with enemies in gangs, and by attacking them, normally we just come off the worst here. We can often collect health though, but really, your best bet is just to try and flee them altogether, as hit collision detection is fairly atrocious, and so the game being fair isn't there from square one. Level design is very bad, and there are jumps that we need to make to reach other platforms, but just seems that the length and height of jumping was designed really badly, and so jumping from platform to platform often sees us falling into pits, whilst gangs then bombard us once again whilst we're in the pit, depleting health very quickly. No Escape released for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive, and dare I say it, but legendary publishers Psygnosis released this trash back in 1994. If you know much about Stallone's film history, you'll know that the 1990s wasn't particularly his greatest decades for massive successful films like he enjoyed in the 1970s and 1980s. Good examples of this being the very poorly received Judge Dredd in 1995, Stop or My Mum Will Shoot in 1992, and finally Rocky V in 1990. It was a bad film to end such a great franchise with, in all fairness, but Cliffhanger was one of those films which was a massive success, and for good reason too. It is a solid action film releasing in 1993 that moved the typical city and decay theme and instead did it in Colorado's Rockies. A few different versions of Cliffhanger were released at the time, including a beat-em-up style for the Super Nintendo, but although most of these games were fairly bad, the NES version, in my opinion, is the very worst of them all. It's a totally infuriating play. Firstly, I don't really need to say it because it's obvious to most, but this game looks terrible. Generally, NES games had a standard to meet Nintendo's requirements to release games officially, but there are oddities like this one that released, and by no means is this a quality game, and not just because of how it looks. We control Gabe in this game, and when I say control, I mean try to control. The controls are just awful. In this game, we tend to punch more the Rocky Mountains wildlife than we do baddies. We of course need to jump from ledges to progress further, and this is where you will begin to lose patience very earlier on in the game. You need to literally jump precisely to another platform in many cases. If you don't, you'll often fall to your death and have to start from scratch at the start of the level. It's just hopeless at times. You'll likely find yourself dying over and over just trying to reach other platforms. I repeatedly attempted to grab the rope on the very first stage, and using a various range of different button combinations versions, I couldn't do it. And in fact, it was that annoying that I actually looked up a walkthrough guide to see if I was doing it correctly, which I was. Grab the rope. It turns out that you need to jump at exactly the right spot to grab this rope. Weirdly enough, with this game, when the levels start, you have to wait a good few seconds to actually start playing the game. Gabe just doesn't move at all. The music is fairly bad too. It's the same loop pretty much all the way through. Probably the only good thing about this NES version is the storyline animations at the start of the game. But really, you might as well just turn it off and just watch the film. I'll be honest with you, I have never heard of the film Surf Ninjas before, and it's very likely the film on most accounts seemed to be that it flopped a big time when it released in 1993. It actually lost money at the box office rather than profiting at all. New Line Cinema released this one, the distribution company put together to release Nightmare on Elm Street. This family film though just didn't impress much, and it's strange as the casting wasn't bad with this film. Rob Schneider, Leslie Nielsen, and even Ernie Reyes Jr., who did the stunts for Donatello and the first two feature-length Turtles films. After reading what this film was about, it's pretty much a cheesy martial arts comedy about two teenage surfers who find out they are actually two crown princes from the fantasy Asian kingdom known as Putasan. The surf ninjas then take on an evil ruling colonel, so of course it was a no-brainer for software publishers to grab an action-based film and turn it into a game. This is of course the Amiga CD32 version, although there was an Amiga 1200 version of this game too. There was also a Sega Game Gear version with a Mega Drive game planned too, but that ultimately got scrapped. Randomly, Sega actually and partially financed this film, and so thought, let's just make a game regardless of how terrible it might be. So for the Amiga versions, Microvalue released these in 1994, and to refresh your minds, Microvalue also released Ninja Rabbits, another poor Commodore 64 and Amiga game. Is this an improvement over Ninja Rabbits, which they released a few years prior? Well, Surf Ninjas actually makes Ninja Rabbits seem like Streets of Rage in comparison. Now honestly, I thought my controller was in the wrong port originally, as controls were so bad. I suddenly realised they were actually in the correct port. This game has probably got the worst collision detection I've ever reviewed or played. We can throw flying kicks at other ninjas, and many times it just doesn't register that a hit collision has occurred, and the same with punching enemies too. There doesn't actually even appear to be a need to even hit enemies, as we can progress onto new screens without even doing so. At the start screen we have an option of music or sound effects. I chose music, and it included music and sound effects together. So what's the point of even asking which you prefer, because they're both included in the game anyways. I eventually walked to a man who was asking for boxes. I thought this was a beat 'em up game. It's all very confusing. I mean, really, this game is just so bad in every way. Like I said, it kind of makes Ninja Rabbits seem as good as Streets of Rage. And as for the character you play as in this game, well, like I said, I've never seen the film before, but I would have thought it was going to be playing as a younger person. Instead, we have some old dude. It's all truly really bizarre. If you're enjoying the content today, please like and subscribe, and also remember to hit that notifications bell and select all so you don't miss upcoming content. This channel also has a wealth of emulation tutorials, including standalone and front-end guides. Just Jamie is your ultimate go-to channel for everything retro related. Anyways, for now, on with the video. As a kid who loved Enter the Dragon and those awesome moves that Bruce Lee pulled off, when Dragon the Bruce Lee story became available to rent around 1994, this was a no-brainer for me. I thought this film was awesome and must have watched it a few times before returning it back to the corner shop when I rented it out. I ended up buying it on VHS soon after. Regardless of how inaccurate it is in terms of being a story of Bruce Lee's life, it was a great action film, my personal favourite scene being the alleyway scene as Bruce takes on the kitchen staff. Today, I still see this as smile away at the pure amazing moves seen in this film, combined with the classic 1960s Green Onions track. Of course, I was sucked into buying the game for the Super Nintendo at the time, but always found it ridiculously difficult and entirely forgettable, which was a real shame. This could have been really a superb one-on-one beat-em-up game, but failed on every level. The game of the film was released on several platforms between 94 and 1995, including the Mega Drive, Game Gear, but this particular version is being played on the doomed Atari Jaguar console. So firstly, I think the game looks fairly impressive here. It's not bad at all, especially the sprites and their movements. Everything looks very faithful to the film, including the first fight, which is taken from the film itself. Problem is, and a very annoying problem, is the controls in collision detection. Your average one-on-one beat-em-up can have you winning a single round in a minute or less, providing we have a good range of moves as well as special moves, and also by having quality hit detection. And this is where Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, epically fails. Although Bruce Lee jumping around looks pretty impressive, it's a real shame that hitting enemies do very little damage. You'll also find yourself getting annoyed very quickly, as you'll start realising that hitting the opponent barely touches their health bar. In addition to his main story mode, we also have a battle mode where we can just select a stage and fight against yourself. Bruce Lee, that is. Very odd. We have most of the iconic backdrops here, including the alleyway, the set of Big Boss, and also the set from Enter the Dragon, which some very strange techno music is in the background of them all. The controls in general are very clunky. It's just really poorly executed and makes a game that had plenty of potential to be good do the exact opposite. A single fight in this game can last for a good few minutes and you'll find yourself jumping around trying your best to quickly take on opponents. It doesn't happen, and this game is flawed in many ways. Back in the day, I pretty much watched and owned every Arnold Schwarzenegger film on VHS, even those more obscure films like Red Sonja, which aren't really talked about much anymore. The Running Man was definitely one of my favourites and depicted a dystopian future where prisoners appeared on a profitable game show known as The Running Man. For making out alive, your prize was freedom. In some ways, The Running Man reminds me of Smash TV, which was an awesome game in the early 90s. The Running Man, though, was one of those typical over-the-top Arnold Schwarzenegger sci-fi action flicks, which is probably best remembered for its pure 1980s cheesiness. But nevertheless, although these days it does admittedly look dated, it's still a superb film, and originally, although it wasn't necessarily a box office super smash, it did manage to break even financially and definitely gained a cult following over the years. You might be also interested to know that at some point this year a remake is due to be released with an entire new cast. Hopefully this won't be as bad as some reboots that we get. Who knows? So as far as the games then, they all released in 1989 by Grand Slam Entertainments on the popular 8-bit and 16-bit home computers at the time. It's generally the case that games based on films are released in the same year, but not in this case. This game released just over 2 years after the film came out. Before I talk about how terrible this game is, developers Emerald Software, who developed a few other notoriously bad Commodore 64 games, such as Moonwalker the video game, which actually I covered in the previous bad film to game tie-ins video, they also did a terrible arcade port of Vigilante. The thing what makes The Running Man so terrible to play is the absolute atrocious controls and hit collision detection. We play as Arne's character Ben, and he walks incredibly slow here and kind of looks strange too as he does so. We can make him run by pressing right or left once and then quickly pressing again. He can jump, and jumping is part of the main issue here. We need to jump over obstacles and you need to be in the precise position, otherwise he just jumps backwards awkwardly, and he does this when walking into something, which gets very frustrating. By the time we take on the main baddies, aka the stalkers, hitting them is easy enough. Killing them takes a long time as hit collision detections are just so bad. We can kill dogs to give us energy, and we get to listen to a fairly annoying loop of a random song whilst all this annoyance is happening all together. We even get some kind of random puzzle elements to this game, which to my knowledge isn't a thing in the film itself. And if all of this wasn't enough, the graphics are very ugly and very blocky for a 1989 C64 game. It's a fairly short game, only this seems to take a lot longer to play, as it can take a very long time taking down stalkers due to the bad collision detection. Back to the Future games are no stranger in this series. We have previously covered Back to the Future 3, as well as the shoddy game for the original film for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Back to the Future Part 2 is my personal favourite of the trilogy, and sadly, fans of the franchise also got some very shoddy games to go with it. There truly was no hope for a decent Back to the Future game in the 80s and 90s. Legend has it, even Christopher Lloyd seen the quality of these games back in the day, and even said it that the quality of these games were so bad that I urged him to say "Great Scott" at some point. Yes, they truly were diabolical enough for Christopher Lloyd to use his character's iconic line to describe them all in just 2 single words. The major 8-bit and 16-bit computers of the day had a version of the game, although this Sega Master System release was the only console at the time to receive a version. Imageworks released it in 1990, and dear lord, this game is likely as frustrating as Back to the Future Part 3 on the Mega Drive. Controlling Marty on the hoverboard is just horrible. What makes this a little confusing is that by pressing the action button, Marty gives an animation or impression that he is able to hit Griff and his gang. But although I tried doing this whilst playing the first stage, there was no indication as to if he was actually hitting or giving any damage to any of the gang members. The most irritating thing about Back to the Future 2 on Master System is that if we collide with another sprite, energy very quickly depletes and it's an instant back to the start game. I will say though that Marty on the hoverboard isn't the only style of gameplay with this release. We get other ridiculous fillers with this version just to pack the game out, almost like a primitive version of a mini games package. We have ridiculous puzzle elements to this game and other bits and pieces which randomly don't particularly fit together, but honestly I had enough of the first stage after just a couple of minutes. I should really do a dedicated Back to the Future games video at some point and rank them all from worst to worst. Possibly one of Robin Williams' most obscure films. This is Toys, which released in '92. It is considered as a surreal comedy, hence the absolute bizarreness of it all. For Jamie Foxx fans, this was actually his debut film, and to star alongside Robin Williams, well, any aspiring actor would jump at the chance. Toys was and still is one of those types of films you either love or hate. It was a massive commercial failure in its day, losing around $25 million. Just like any film that flopped in its day, they generally adopt a cult following like this one's done through the years. The Mega Drive and Super Nintendo both received a game of the film, in which Absolute Entertainment released them both back in '93. A strange game to release by 1993 in that the film was a huge commercial failure. So what would make a game of Toys better than the film itself? Well, absolutely nothing at all. In fact, the game and the film probably got a more negative bunch of reviews on release than the film did itself, and for good reason too. The games are extremely very poor, and what would you expect from the same development team who brought us the terrible game of Home Alone 2 Lost in New York? We can expect a fairly annoying game with annoying level design, terrible weapons, and sprites that move so quickly it is hard to shoot at them with the bunch of ridiculous weapons that we have to use. Legend has it that we can actually get a better shot at enemies in this game by lining up bowling balls with the lines on the floor in order to shoot at tanks and other random toys that are out to kill you. The objective of the first stage is very strange. It tells us at the start to take down security cameras. What it doesn't actually tell you is that you first need to destroy certain toys before you can actually do this. What makes this game so bad is the sporadic movement of the enemies and the speeds they are travelling at. Using the various weapons that we get here are so bad, I need to wait a couple of seconds before your weapons actually take effect. Like I said, this game is extremely poorly designed in every way conceivable. It's a truly horrible play which offers no fun and no real reason to ever play it again. And that's it for another 10 of the worst movie to games tie-ins today. So did you necessarily agree with part 3 today? Which game did you suffer with back in the day? Drop us a comment in the comment section and let's hear some horror stories of your experiences with some of these games in this video. Until next time, stay retro.